Thank you, Professor. Very generous introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. My first duty, which is also a pleasure, is to thank the University of Notre Dame for inviting me onto its terrain, and Mr. O'Duffy in particular, in an institution that's also identified, I believe, with the great history and people of Ireland, for taking the revenge of arranging for English weather to greet me. Now, I've been given 15 minutes, which isn't that much, but I could do it in a way in two, like this, as a proposition. When Gertrude Stein was dying, some of you will know this story, she asked, as her last hour approached, well, what is the answer? And when no one around her bed spoke, she rephrased and said, well, in that case, what is the question? And I'm speaking tonight, we are speaking tonight, we're met tonight at an institution of higher learning. And the greatest obligation that you have is to keep an open mind and to realize that in our present state, human society, we're more and more overborne by how little we know and how little we know about more and more, or if you like, how much more we know, but how much less we know as we find out how much more and more there is to know. In these circumstances, which I believe to be undeniable, the only respectable intellectual position is one of doubt, skepticism, reservation, and free, and I'd stress free and unfettered inquiry. In that lies, as it has always lain, our only hope. So you should beware always of those who say that these questions have already been decided. In particular, to those who tell you that they've been decided by revelation, that there are handed down commandments and precepts that predate, in a sense, ourselves, and that the answers are already available if only we could see them, and that the obligation upon ourselves to debate ethical and moral and historical and other questions is thereby dissolved. It seems to me that that is the one position, it's what I call the faith position, that has to be discarded first. So, thank you for your attention, and I'm done. Except that it seems that I have a reputation for demagogy to live up to. When I come to a place like this, I read the local paper, the Campus Observer in this case, and I was sorry to see that Dinesh and I are not considered up to the standards of Father Richard McBrien, whose exacting standards, I dare say, are out of our reach. And I was also sorry to see myself and others represented in other papers, and in particular by a distinguished cleric in St. Peter's on Good Friday, who made a speech through which His Holiness the Pope sat in silence, Father Cantalamessa, saying that people like myself are part of a pogrom, a persecution comparable only to that of the Jews, with the church in mind. This is the first time I've ever been accused of being part of a pogrom or a persecution. But as long as it's going on, I'll also add that it's the only pogrom I've ever heard of that's led by small, deaf and dumb children whose cries for justice have been ignored. And while that is the definition of the pogrom, I'll continue to support it because I think it demonstrates very clearly the moral superiority of the secular concept of justice and law over canon law and religious law, with its sickly emphasis on self-exculpation in the guise of forgiveness and redemption. That's not the only reason why religion is a problem. It's a problem principally because it is man-made, because to an extent it is true, as the church used to preach when it had more confidence, that we are, in some sense, originally sinful and guilty. If you want to prove that, you only have to look at the many religions that people have constructed to see that they are indeed the product of an imperfectly evolved primate species, about half a chromosome away from a chimpanzee, with a prefrontal lobe that's too small, an adrenaline gland that's too big, and various other evolutionary deformities about which we're finding out ever more. A species that is predatory. A man is a wolf to man, homo homini lupus, as has well been said. A species that's very fearful of itself and others and of the natural order, and above all, very, very willing, despite its protestations of religious modesty, to be convinced that the operations of the cosmos and the universe are all operating with us in mind. Make up your mind whether you want to be modest or not. But don't say that you are made out of dust, or if you're a woman, out of a bit of rib, or if you're a Muslim, out of a clot of blood, and you're an abject sinner born into guilt. But add, nonetheless, let's cheer up. The whole universe is still designed with you in mind. This is not modesty or humility. It's a man-made false consolation, in my judgment, and it does great moral damage. It warps, it begins by warping what we might call our moral sense of proportion. I wish that was all that could be said, though I think that's the most important thing. I ought to say why I think it ought to be credited. And I ought to add that my colleagues Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett have been very generous in this respect. This debate would be uninteresting if religion was one-dimensional. Religion was our first attempt to make sense of our surroundings. It was our first attempt at cosmology, for example, to make sense of what goes on in the heavens. It was our first attempt at what I care about the most, the study of literature and literary criticism. It gave us texts to deliberate and even to debate about, even if some of those texts were held to be the word of God and beyond review and beyond criticism, nonetheless the idea is introduced, and it had never been introduced before. It's our first attempt at healthcare, in one way. If you go to the shaman or the witch doctor, and you make the right propitiations, the right sacrifices, and you really believe in it, you do have a better chance of recovery. Everybody knows it's a medical fact. Morale is an ingredient in health, and it was our first attempt at that too. It was our first very bad attempt at human solidarity because it was tribe-based, but nonetheless it taught that there were virtues in sticking together. And it was our first attempt, I would say also, this is not an exhaustive list, at psychiatric care, at dealing with the terrible loneliness of the human condition, at what happens when the individual spirit looks out shivering into the enormous void of the cosmos and contemplates its own extinction and deals with the awful fear of death. This was the first attempt to apply any balm to that awful question. But, as Charles Darwin says of our own evident kinship with lower mammals and lower forms of life, we bear, as he puts it in The Origin of Species, we bear always the ineffaceable stamp of our lowly origin. I'll repeat it, the ineffaceable stamp of our lowly origin. Religion does the same thing. It quite clearly shows that it's the first, the most primitive, the most crude, and the most deluded attempt to make sense. It is the worst attempt, but partly because it was the first. So the credit can be divided in that way. And the worst thing it did was to offer us certainty, to say, these are truths that are unalterable, they're handed down from on high, we only have to learn God's will and how to obey it in order to free ourselves from these dilemmas. That's probably the worst advice of all. Heinrich Heine says that if you're in a dark wood on a dark night and you don't know where you are and you've never been through this territory before, you may be well advised to hire as a guide the local mad, blind old man who can feel his way through the forest, because he can do something you can't. But when the dawn breaks and the light comes, you would be silly if you continued to operate with this guide, this blind, mad old man who was doing his best with the first attempt. To give you just two very contemporary examples, to have a germ theory of disease relieves you of the idea that plagues are punishments, that the church used to preach, that plagues come because the Jews have poisoned the wells, as the church very often preached, or that the Jews even exist and are themselves a plague, as the church used to preach when it felt strong enough and also was morally weak enough and had such little evidence. You can free yourself from the idea that diseases are punishments or visitations. If you study plate tectonics, you won't do what the Archbishop of Haiti did the other day, speaking to his sorrowing people after his predecessor had been buried in the ruins of the cathedral at Port-au-Prince, along with 250,000 other unfortunate Haitians whose lives were miserable enough as it was, and to say, with the Cardinal Archbishop of New York standing next to him, that God had something to say to Haiti, and this is the way he chose to say it. If you study if you study plate tectonics and a few other things, you will free yourself of this appalling burden from our superstitious, fearful primate past. And I suggest, again, to an institution of higher learning, that's a responsibility we all have to take on. If we reflect, some people say, the great Stephen Jay Gould, who I admired very much, from whom we all learned a great deal about evolutionary biology, used to say, rather leniently, I think, that, well, these are non-overlapping magisteria, the material world, the scientific world, and the faith world. I think non-overlapping is too soft. I think it's more a question, really, increasingly, of it being a matter of incompatibility, or perhaps better to say, irreconcilability. Just if you reflect on a few things I'll have time, I hope, to mention. My timer, by the way, isn't running, so I'm under your discipline, Professor. You'll give me... 4.5 minutes. Very good. When we reflect that the rate of expansion of our universe is increasing, it was thought until Hubble that we knew it was expanding, but that surely Newton would teach us that the rate would diminish. No, the rate is increasing. The Big Bang is speeding up. We can see the end of it coming increasingly clearly, and while we wait for that, we can see the galaxy of Andromeda moving nearer towards the collision that's coming with us. You can see it now in the night sky. This is the object of a design, you think? What kind of designer in that case? To say that this must have an origin, and now we know how it's going to end, why ask why there's something rather than nothing when you can see the nothingness coming? Only replaces the question. Faith is of no use in deciding it. And that's on the macro level. From the macro to the micro, 99.8% of all species ever created, if you insist, on the face of this planet have already become extinct, leaving no descendants. I might add that of that number, 3 or 4 branches of our own family, Homo sapiens, branches of it, the Cro-Magnons, the Neanderthals, who were living with us until about 50,000 years ago, who had tools, who made art, who decorated graves, who clearly had a religion, who must have had a God, who must have abandoned them, who must have let them go. They're no longer with us. We don't know what their last cries were like. And our own species was down to about 10,000 in Africa before we finally got out of there, unforsaken this time or so far, to move from the macro, in other words, to the micro. Our own solar system is only halfway through its allotted span before it blows up. And as Sir Martin Ryle, the great astronomer royal and professor of cosmology at Cambridge, and incidentally a believing Anglican, says, by the time there are creatures on the earth who look as the sun expires, they will not be human. It will not be humans who see this happen if our planet lives that long. The creatures that watch it happen will be as far different from us as we are from amoebae and bacteria. Faced with these amazing, overarching, titanic, I would say awe-inspiring facts, like the fact that ever since the Big Bang, every single second, a star the size of ours has blown up. While I've been talking, once every second, a star the size of our sun has gone out. Faced with these amazing, indisputable facts, can you be brought to believe that the main events in human history, the crucial ones, happened 3,000 to 2,000 years ago in illiterate desert Arabia and Palestine, and that it was at that moment only that the heavens decided it was time to intervene, and that by those interventions we can ask for salvation? Can you be brought to believe this? I stand before you as someone who quite simply cannot, and who refuses, furthermore, to be told that if I don't believe it, I wouldn't have any source for ethics or morality. Please don't pile the insulting onto the irrational and tell me that if I don't accept these sacrifices in the desert, I have no reason to tell right from wrong.
1 minute.
1 minute. Good. Then I'll have to prune, and you'll be the losers. But there's a rebuttal coming. All right. Look at the contemporary religious scene. I return to religion as well as just faith and belief. Israeli settlers are stealing other people's land in the hope of bringing on the Messiah and a terrible war. On the alternative side, as it thinks of itself, the Islamic jihadists are preparing a war without end, a faith-based war based on the repulsive tactic of suicide murder. And all of these people believe that they have a divine warrant, a holy book, and the direct word of God on their side. We used to worry when I was young, what will happen when a maniac gets hold of a nuclear weapon? We're about to discover what happens when that happens. The Islamic Republic of Iran is about to get a nuclear weapon, and by illegal means that flout every possible international law and treaty. Meanwhile, in Russia, the authoritarian, chauvinistic, expansionist regime of Vladimir Putin is increasingly decked in clerical garb by the Russian Orthodox Church with its traditional allegiance to Tsarism, serfdom, and the rest of it. And Dinesh would have to argue, and I'll close on this, Dinesh would have to argue that surely that's better than that there be a mass outbreak of secularism in Russia and Iran and Israel and Saudi Arabia. And I would call that a reductio ad absurdum. And I'll leave you with it, and I'll be back. Thanks.
I don't know. And now Dinesh D'Souza. Do you want to use this one?
It'd be great. Just face it my way. Yes. Go. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Wow, this is a beautiful auditorium, quite an event. I understand the tickets were I almost didn't get in myself. I have been listening with some interest to Christopher Hitchens. Listening to him, I feel a little bit like Winston Churchill during the Boer War. He said it is always exhilarating to be shot at without result. And I say this because even if everything that Christopher Hitchens says is true, he has hardly demonstrated religion to be a very serious problem at all. He seems to say that religion is built into human nature. It's an evolutionary development, that man has been searching for explanations since he set foot on the planet. Religion supplied functional explanations. Now perhaps we have better ones. Even if all this were true, I'm going to dispute it and show it's not true, but even if it were true, this would hardly be a damning indictment of religion. Science itself has developed in the same way. It's been an explanation. It's gotten better over time. But what I want to do is meet Christopher on his own ground. He says we should be doubters, and I'm going to be a doubter. He says we should be skeptics, and I endorse that completely. In this debate, at no time will I make any arguments that appeal to revelation, scripture, or authority. I'll make arguments based on reason alone. And I want to engage the argument on Hitchens' own ground not by making the easy argument for the utility of religion. It's good for us, it makes practical sense, it's consoling. That's all true. I'm going to actually make an argument for the truth of religion. And the argument I'm going to make, well, I call it the presuppositional argument, but it's an argument that requires a little bit of explanation. Imagine if you're a detective and you approach a crime scene. And all the evidence points to a suspect, but it turns out he couldn't have done it. Why? Because the body was dumped in one location and he was in a completely different location. And then it hits you as a detective, wait a minute, perhaps the guy had an accomplice. Now, you don't know that he did, but the assumption that he did suddenly makes sense of all the other facts that were previously mysterious. Suddenly you see how the crime was committed to its very detail. If this seems like a little bit of an unusual way to argue, I want to emphasize that this is precisely the way in which scientists argue when faced with new phenomena. For example, scientists looking at galaxies out there have noticed that the galaxies hang together, and yet when you measure the amount of matter in them, there's not enough gravity to hold the galaxies together. They should be flying apart. And so scientists presuppose that there is some other form of matter, they call it dark matter, that must be there, exercising a gravitational force, so even though we can't see the dark matter, it's detectable by no instrument, it explains what we do see. The presupposition of dark matter clarifies the matter that is in front of us. Now, what I'm going to do is try to adduce some puzzling facts about life, and then ask whether the presupposition of God explains those facts better than any rival explanation. Christopher Hitchens has spent a lot of time telling us about evolution. And evolution as an effort to explain the presence of life on the planet. But of course, evolution does not explain the presence of life on the planet. Darwin knew that. Evolution merely explains the transition between one life form and another. That's very different from accounting for life itself. Consider, for example, the primordial cell. If you read Franklin Harold's book, The Way of the Cell, this is a biologist at University of Colorado in Boulder, he describes the cell as a kind of supercomputer. It is of a level of complexity. Even Richard Dawkins, in his work, describes the cell as a kind of digital computer. Now, the cell can't have evolved because evolution presupposes the cell. Evolution requires a cell that already has the built-in capacity to reproduce itself. So how did we get a cell? The very idea that random molecules in a warm pond through a bolt of lightning assembled a cell would be akin to saying that a bolt of lightning in a warm pond could assemble an automobile or a skyscraper. It's preposterous. Richard Dawkins knows it's preposterous, and therefore when asked, how did we get life originally, he said, well, maybe aliens brought it from another planet. It's ridiculous, but it's, in a way, the best explanation he could come up with other than intelligent design. So there we go. We have the mystery of the cell. But evolution raises further puzzles, because evolution depends upon a universe structured in a certain way. Evolution depends on a sun that's 8 light minutes away. Evolution depends upon the constants of nature. If I were to pick up a pen and drop it, it will fall at a known acceleration to the ground, gravity. The universe has a whole bunch of these constants, hundreds of them. Scientists have asked, what if these constants, on which evolution depends, what if these constants were changed a little bit? What if the speed of light were a little slower or a little faster? This question is addressed by Stephen Hawking in his book, A Brief History of Time. He says that if you change these constants of nature at all, and he's talking about the rate of expansion of the universe, he says if you change that not 10% or 1%, but 1 part in 100,000 millionth million, we would have no universe, we would have no life. Not just Homo sapiens, no complex life would have evolved anywhere. In other words, our very existence here is dependent upon the fine-tuning of a set of constants in nature. We're not talking about just on Earth, the entire universe. This argument, that is sometimes called the anthropic principle of the fine-tuned universe, this has put modern atheism completely on the defensive. Why should the universe be structured in precisely this way and no other way? What is the best explanation? Is there an atheist explanation? I'd like to hear it. Let's move on in thinking about evolution, because evolution cannot explain the depth of human evil. What I mean by this is simply this. Evolution presumes cruelty, evolution presumes harshness, but it is a harshness tempered by necessity. Think of a lion. It wants to eat the antelope because it's hungry, but have you ever heard of a lion that wants to wipe every antelope off the face of the earth? No. So how do you explain this human evil that far outruns necessity and reaches depths that seem almost unfathomable? Evolution cannot account for rationality, because evolution says we are programmed in the world to survive and reproduce. Our minds are organs of survival. They are not organs of truth. So if we believe in rationality, we require something outside of evolution to account for that. Evolution can't even account for morality. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation, so think of a couple of moral facts. And I'm not talking about heroic deeds of greatness. Think of simple things. Getting up to give your seat to an old lady in a bus. Donating blood. There's a famine in Haiti, you volunteer your time or you write a check. Now, if we are evolved primates who are programmed to survive and reproduce, why would we do these things? There's a whole literature on this, and basically it comes down to this. The advocates of evolution say, well, evolution is a form of extended selfishness. If a mother jumps into a burning car to save her 2 children, that's because she and her children have the same genes. So what seems like an altruistic and noble deed is actually merely a cunning strategy on the part of the mom to make sure her genes make it into the next generation. We're not talking about her Levi's. We're talking about her genetic inheritance. Or evolution appeals to what can be called reciprocal advantage. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. A businessman may be nice to a customer, not because he thinks he's a great guy, but because he wants him to come back into the store again. But these 2 common evolutionary strategies to explain morality don't explain the 3 examples I gave at all. I'm in a bus, the old lady hobbles in. She's not a relative, she isn't grandma. So genetic kinship doesn't come into it, and neither does reciprocal advantage. I don't say, well, I think I'll give her my seat because next week I want her seat. No, you give up your seat because you're a nice guy. You give up blood because you want to do a good thing. You donate your time to help strangers who are genetically unrelated to you and can't reciprocate your favors. These are the simple facts of morality in the world. And what is the evolutionary explanation for them? There is none, or if there is one, I would like to hear it. So in debating these issues, very often it's very easy to knock the burden of proof onto the theist and say, you explain everything. But no, in the world we're not in the position where there's only one explanation contending. There are rival explanations. There is a theist explanation, the God explanation, and there is a non-theist or atheist explanation. We have to weigh the 2 against each other. My contention is that the atheist explanation flounders when confronted with all these facts: the complexity of the cell, the fine-tuning of the universe, the fact of morality, the depth of human evil, the reality of morality in the world. What about the God explanation? Seems obvious to me. It does one heck of a lot better. Why do we have a cell that shows the structure of complexity? Because the cell has been intelligently designed, perhaps by an intelligent designer. Why does the universe show complexity and rationality? Well, those are the characteristics of the Creator who made it that way. Why are there depths of human evil? Because our lives are a cosmic drama in which good and evil are in constant struggle. The Christian story. Why is there morality in the world? Why do we all feel, even when it works against our advantage, a moral law within us? Well, that's because there is a moral lawgiver who gave it to us. So when we put it all together, the presupposition of God is invisible. I concede that. We can't see him. But if we posit him, all these mysterious facts, suddenly the lights come on. It provides an explanation. Now again, with any presuppositional argument, there may be a better alternative explanation. And so I put the ball into Christopher Hitchens' court to say, if you can explain these facts better than I can, I will happily, as a skeptic, concede to your point of view. Give me a better explanation for these facts. I leave you with this thought. Ultimately, we know that belief is good for us. If it was a primitive explanation of 3,000 years ago, why would it be the case that religion hasn't disappeared 3,000 years ago? Why is it the case that we're actually seeing religious revivals around the world? Why is the fact of religious experience? It's almost as if you go to a village and 95% of those people in the village say, we know this guy named Bill. Why? Because we interact with him, we relate to him, we have experience of him. 5 guys say, we've never met Bill, and 3 of them say there is no Bill. The other 95% are making him up. Now, which is more likely? Is it likely that the 3% are right and the 95% are lying or hallucinating? Or is it more likely that the 95% are right and the other 3% just don't know the guy? When you look at the fact of religious experience in the world today, to simply write it off as a primitive explanation of why ancient man couldn't explain the thunder seems idiotically unrelated to the fact that religion serves current needs and current wants. So religion is not the problem. God is not the problem. God is, in fact, the answer to the problem. Thank you.
I never hear Dinesh doing that without thinking what a wonderful Muslim he would make. You try telling 100 people in Saudi Arabia that you don't think the Prophet Muhammad really heard those voices. You're going to be really outvoted. And yes, Dinesh, I have noticed there are religious revivals going on. I pay a lot of attention to them. I don't find them as welcome, perhaps, as you do. And on your detective hypothesis, don't you think there's something to be said for considering unfalsifiability when constructing a hypothesis? For example, Albert Einstein staked his reputation. He said, if I'm wrong about this, then there will not be an eclipse at a certain time of day and month and year off the west coast of Africa, and I will look a fool. But if I'm right, there will be one. And people foregathered thinking he can't be that smart, and he was. Professor J.B.S. Haldane used to be asked, well, what would shake your faith in evolution? This was when it was much more controversial than it is now, and I'm impressed to find that Dinesh believes in intelligent design, which really does require, I would think, a leap of faith, but there it is. Haldane said, well, show me rabbits' bones in the Jurassic layer, and I'll give up. Now, can you think of any religious spokesman you've ever heard who would tell you in advance what would disprove their hypothesis? Of course you can't, because it's unfalsifiable. And we were all taught, weren't we, by Professor Karl Popper, that unfalsifiability in a theory is a test not of its strength, but of its weakness. So you can't beat it. The church used to say, no, God didn't allow evolution. Indeed, instead, he hid the bones in the rocks to test our faith. That didn't work out too well. So now they say, now we know about it. It proves how incredibly clever he was all along. It's an infinitely elastic airbag. And there's no argument that I can bring or anyone else can bring against it, and that's what should make you suspicious. Then a question for Dinesh. I know I'm supposed to be answering them as well as asking them, but it does intrigue me when I debate with religious people. He announced, I have his words, he was going to talk without reference to revelation, scripture, or scriptural authority. Now, why, ask yourselves then, I'll ask you, why is that? Why do I never come up against someone who says, I'll tell you why I'm religious, because I think that Jesus of Nazareth is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except by him. And if you will believe on this, you will be given eternal life. I'd be impressed if people would sometimes say that. Why do the religious people so often feel they must say, no, we don't, well, that's all sort of metaphorical? In what sense are they then religious? You'll notice that Dinesh talked about the operations of the divine and the creator only in the observable natural order. That's what used to be called the deist position. It was the position held by skeptics like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson by the end of the 18th century. It was as far as anyone could see before Darwin and before Einstein. There appeared to be evidence of design in the universe, but there was no evidence of divine intervention in it. Very important point. The deist may say, and I would have to say, it cannot be disproved that there was a first cause and that it was godly. That cannot be disproved. It can only be argued that there's no evidence for it. But the deists, having established that position, if they have, has all their work still ahead of them to show that there is a God who cares about us, even knows we exist, takes sides in our little tribal wars, cares who we sleep with and in what position, cares what we eat and on what day of the week, arbitrates matters of this kind. That's the conceited, that's the endless human wish to believe that we have parents who want to look out for us and help us not to grow up or get out of the way. And so it surprises me that there are no professions of real religious faith ever made on these occasions. Now, I suppose I should then say what my own method in this is, since I was challenged on that point. Take the two figures of Jesus of Nazareth and Socrates. I believe Jesus of Nazareth operates on the fringe of mythology and prehistory. I don't think it's absolutely certainly established there was such a person, or that he made those pronouncements, or that he was the Son of God, or the son of a virgin, or any of these things. And I would likewise have to concede that we only know of the work of Socrates through second-hand sources, in the same way, second or third-hand. Quite impressive ones in some cases, from Plato's Apology, but it can't be demonstrated to me that Socrates ever walked the streets of Athens.
That's 5 minutes.
How many?
That's That's 5 minutes.
That's fine. Just quickly, though. If it could be shown to a believing Christian, the grave of Jesus opened and the body of him found and the resurrection disproved, if that could be archaeologically done, for the sake of argument, it would presumably be a disaster for you. You'd have to think, then we're alone. Then how are we going to know right from wrong? What can we do? I maintain with Socrates that, on the contrary, the moral problems and ethical problems and other dilemmas that we have would be exactly the same as they are. What are our duties to each other? How could we build the just city? How should we think? How can we face the possibility of our loneliness? How can we do right and do wrong? These questions would remain exactly as they are, and as they do. And so all that is necessary is to transcend the superstitious, transcend the mythical, and accept the responsibility, take it on ourselves, that no one can do this for us. And I would hope that in a great university, that thought might carry the day. Thank you.
Somewhat like the mosquito in the nudist colony, I'm trying to decide where to begin. I might begin by noting that in my opening statement, I offered a kind of a challenge to Christopher Hitchens. I mentioned anomalous features of the world as it is and of the evolutionary explanation, and offered to him the chance to offer rival theories that might do better than the God explanation. I just want to note that he has offered none. Instead, what he has offered is the idea that science is based on verifiability, but religion not. This, I think, is in fact not true. And he said no one's ever given him an example of it, and I'm about to give him two. The ancient Hebrews asserted, uniquely, by the way, of all religions, that God made the universe out of nothing. Now, incidentally, the idea that God or gods made the universe is a very old idea. But in every other religion, God or gods fashioned the universe out of some other stuff. God is a kind of carpenter. He took the stuff of the universe and he made life and he made man. But the Hebrews said no, there was nothing. And then there was a universe. And I want to suggest that modern science has proved this to be 100% correct. If you go to an introductory physics class at Notre Dame, you will learn that as a direct consequence of the Big Bang, not only did the universe have a beginning, not only did all the matter have a beginning, but space and time also had a beginning. In other words, first there was nothing, no space, no time. And then there was a universe with space and time. Suddenly the Christian concept of eternity, of a God being outside of space and time, which for centuries was scientifically unintelligible, is now not only coherent, but riding alongside the most cutting-edge discoveries in modern physics and modern astronomy. The ancient Hebrews and the Old Testament predicts that the people of Israel, after being dispersed, would return. There would be, if you will, a reuniting of the state of Israel. Until the 1940s, this was a possibility historically so preposterous that if someone had actually suggested it, they would meet with derisive laughter. And yet, it has in fact happened, just as the Bible said it would. Now, these are not scientific theories. If you talk to the ancient Hebrews and say, how do you know that there was nothing and there was a universe? They didn't do any scientific experiments. They basically said, God told me. But I'm saying that if you look at that as a prophecy or as a factual claim about the world, we now know 2,000 years later that it is in its essence correct. The reason that I can't go on like this is because religion addresses different types of questions than scientific questions. Here are three. Here we are flung into the world. One question we have is, what's the purpose of our life? Or why are we here? Or where are we going? What happens to us after we die? Here are the scientific answers to those three questions. Don't have a clue, don't have a clue, and don't have a clue. We are no closer to answering those questions scientifically than we were since the time of the Babylonians. So what is wrong in looking to religion to supply explanations in a domain where science is utterly inert, inarticulate, and in fact mute? You can't just say that if you understand the ballistics of plate tectonics, you understand purpose. It would be as if my dad took me on his knee and gave me a spanking, and Christopher Hitchens goes, "Don't think he's angry with you. If you only understood the ballistics of the cane, you would have a full explanation of what's going on." Or on the other hand, if I put a pot of tea on the kettle and began to boil it, Hitchens can't say, "Well, if I tell you about if you say, what's going on here?" Well, the scientific explanation is that water, when heated, the molecules expand, the temperature rises. But there's another explanation. Dinesh wants to have a cup of tea. So explanations work at more than one level. And finally, Christopher asks, why argue this way? Well, we know about presenting the case the other way. In fact, you get it in church, or you get it in synagogue, or you get it every Sunday. The argument from the Bible, the argument from authority. I know it's a useless argument to use in a secular setting, especially when debating with an atheist. If I say, I believe in Jesus because the book of Matthew says this, or the Gospel of Luke says that, he's going to say, well, who cares what the Gospel of Luke says? I don't accept the authority of the Bible to adjudicate the matter. So we are at a state in our culture in which we have to use rational arguments if we are trying to communicate in secular venues. So here we are at a university. What could be more appropriate than to address these arguments in the vocabulary of reason? Christopher wants me to fling the Bible at him so he can then claim the high ground of science and reason. What flummoxes him is when I use science and reason itself to torpedo his arguments. That's when you get him going down on his knees and praying for some more quotations from Scripture. Thank you very much.
We now have time for questions. We have 2 microphones down in front. If you have a question for either of our speakers, please come forward and line up. It has been suggested that I start the question period with a question for each of our 2 speakers. That's an opportunity I gladly accept. After I'm done asking questions, I'll field questions from the audience. Please, you're free to indicate to whom your question is directed, but we'll give both speakers the opportunity to weigh in. Please limit yourself to 1 brief question. I'm the only one that gets 2. If your question runs long, I will interrupt and ask you to focus it. If it continues to run long, I will ask you to sit down. If it continues to run long, you don't want that to happen. There will be no follow-up questioning. Once you've asked your question, please step aside from the mic, and those are the ground rules. So now I'll start with questions. As I understand it, the basic argument that Christopher Hitchens is giving, I haven't seen the text, but as I understand it, the argument can be summed up roughly like this. Religion gives explanations, science gives better explanations. Our job is to go with the best explanations. So we ought to go in for science all the time and set religion aside as superstition. D'Souza wants to address this on Hitchens' turf. So I'm going to start by asking a question of D'Souza. It looked like your goal was to show that theistic explanations are in fact better than scientific explanations. As I saw it, what you in fact said showed that scientific explanations are often problematic, incomplete, and gappy, but I don't think you showed that theistic explanations are better. And just to pick a couple of examples, so for example, you talk about the fine-tuning argument. So here's a case where maybe belief in God explains certain features of the universe better than atheistic theories would. But of course, one wonders if the world is superintended by a perfectly good God, whence the Holocaust, right? Whence all manner of horrendous evil and suffering. And so all of a sudden, it looks like the appeal to God to explain features of the universe, it's not clear that theism's winning. Take morality too, right? On the one hand, sure, we maybe can understand where moral laws come from if there's a divine lawgiver. On the other hand, Christianity has a doctrine of original sin. Christianity has other things that confound our moral intuitions, right? So again, it's not clear that theism wins.
Well, that's a lot to chew on. Look, the standards that I'm appealing to are, in a way, very intuitive. We have currently a major scientific project to look for life on other planets. Now, truth of it is, if we were to get information that on, let's say, the moon Europa, we found hieroglyphics, some interesting architectural structures, some apparent roving vehicles, this would settle the argument. Right away, we would conclude, as long as we didn't put them there, that there must be some other forms of life that have done that. If someone came along and said molecules of sand assembled themselves into all this, this would be an explanation, but a stupid one, compared to the inference to intelligent design. So, in fact, the scientists say that even if we get radio signals in Morse code, they would be adequate to demonstrate the existence of intelligent life elsewhere. So my point is, let's apply the reasonable standard. If we see a fine-tuned universe, what's more likely? Someone fine-tuned it, or it fine-tuned itself? Could the universe have created itself out of nothing? Is there some alternative explanation for the data at hand? No. So I'm simply saying, let's go with the best explanation. By the way, my argument isn't eternal. If 20 years from now you had a scientific argument that was better, that said, hey, we figured it all out, I would go with that. I would have to drop this argument. I'm saying that in the current mode of knowledge and thinking, this is a successful explanation. You can't change the subject and say, well, now explain the Holocaust. That requires a different set of rebuttals. I would say the Holocaust is a product of free will. God didn't do the Holocaust, Hitler did. The Nazis did. To try to deflect blame to God for human action voluntarily undertaken is to minimize the human capacity for evil. But whether or not that argument works, it has nothing to do with the design argument. And finally, morality, very briefly. Again, if evolution could adequately account for morality, let's remember that the atheist premise is that we are evolved creatures in the world, and that's it. So evolution has to do a lot of work. It has to explain the human desire to give blood to strangers. If it can't do that, then it fails as an adequate explanation for a very important form of human behavior, morality, that is seen in every culture known to man. It requires explanation. I have an alternative explanation, that in human beings there are two parts. We are evolutionary creatures in the world. That explains why we desire sex and we desire food to survive, to reproduce. But then I have this other thing inside of me, what Adam Smith calls the impartial spectator. And that's another voice. And it's in me, but it's not of me. In fact, it's often stopping me from doing what I want to do. It's blocking my self-interest. Where does that come from? How does evolution account for that? So I'm saying that the God hypothesis casts more light on that subject, the hypothesis of a moral lawgiver. In fact, even the hypothesis of a life to come. You may say a final court in which our moral deeds will be adjudicated. Explains why we act the way we do now. Otherwise, our own behavior is incomprehensible to us. That's the strength of the presuppositional argument.
Do you want to comment on this, or just take my question for you?
I think both. I'll stand up for your question, and I'll see if I can do both. But I know people are impatient to get to the next segment. Bring it on.
My question for you is very quick. Your argument seems to rest on the idea that religion is an explanatory enterprise, and that the warrant for believing the doctrines of a particular religion comes from their explanatory value. Why would you think that?
Well, because of religion's own very large claims. And because, it's something I didn't have time to go into, because not all these religions can be simultaneously true. I mean, there are enormous numbers of competing religions. It's another reason that it's obvious to me that they're man-made. It's what you would expect if it was man-made. There'd be lots of religions with incompatible claims and theologies, and that this would lead to further quarreling. Either one of them is completely true, as the Roman Church used to say, it was the one true church. Some of its members still do. Or all of them are false, or all of them are true, which of course can't be true. Now to Dinesh. And the matter of anomalies and the question of ex nihilo. Half the time when I debate, it's people saying, nothing can come from nothing, you can't get something from nothing, so since there is something, someone must have wanted there to be something. Not, I think, a very impressive syllogism. I can't do it all this evening, but it's very easy for anyone to go and see Professor Lawrence Krauss deliver his brilliant lecture online called A Whole Universe from Nothing, which explains to you how indeed you can get very large numbers of things from nothing with the proper understanding of quantum theory. And then tonight Dinesh says, really there was nothing, and the Hebrews were so clever that they knew that. And therefore they must have been right about God as well. This is ridiculous. The ancient Hebrews also thought that God made man and women out of nothing or out of dust and clay, whereas we have an exact knowledge, or increasingly exact knowledge, of precisely the genetic materials in common with other creatures from which we were assembled. And then, not content with that, he says biblical prophecy is true in respect of Palestine. This is an extraordinary thing, and you were right to mention the Holocaust. If it's true that God wanted the Jews to get back to Palestine, then it must have been true that he wanted their exile to be ended, the galut, as it's known to Zionism, the exile, the wandering. And we know how that wandering was ended, by Christian Europe throwing living Jewish babies into furnaces. Well, that must be part of the plan then, mustn't it? And some rabbis used to claim that, by the way. They used to claim that the Holocaust was a punishment for exile. And then people started to desert the synagogue, so they shut up about it until the '67 war. And then when the Israeli army got the Wailing Wall back, they said, we shouldn't have spoken so quickly. Actually, this was what God always had in mind all along, the conquest by Jews of the Palestinians, where you see how brilliantly that's worked out. I don't think it's wise or moral or decent to try and detect the finger of God in human quarrels. I think the enterprise is futile, and it incidentally shows the absurdity of all arguments from design. Thank you.